Hello chess friends and welcome to Out of Chess channel and welcome back to our Queen's Game Decline series. So in this series we're following this very nice opening from White's and from Black's perspective, and today we're continuing with our Queen's Game Decline studies and the so-called Baltic defense. The Baltic defense we have started recently. First we had this intro video in which I've showed you the most important tactical ideas and the most important traps that I think you have to know if you want of course to study this opening, and today we're analyzing now the Baltic defense a little bit more from Black's perspective, because I found really beautiful game that was played by the Stockfish engine against another top engine Chiron. Here Stockfish will play the Baltic defense, and the most incredible thing is that Stockfish won the game with the Baltic defense, which is really wild when I think about it harder, because the Baltic defense is in my opinion still something that you should try to avoid. There are many great ways for White to beat the Baltic defense, but here Stockfish shows the most important tactical ideas and also strategical ideas how to make something out of it, because in the beginning you don't gain so much, you have structural weaknesses, and then maybe, just maybe, if you improve your structural weakness, then you have of course maybe good chances in the middle game stage. So let's check out now again what is the Baltic defense and how Stockfish, the top engine Stockfish, handled this opening. So here d4 was played by Chiron, we have d5, we have c4, the Queen's Gambit, and now comes the Baltic defense move, which is now the move bishop to f5. And with the best way, really the best way for White here is to proceed simply with c takes d5, because the problem is always that if you recapture with the queen, we have talked about also these ideas in, yesterday, then you get this extra tempo here by White, knight to c3, and after something like queen to a5, maybe to prevent here the move e4, many times White will play bishop to d2 and will still launch his e4 centralizing move, and then White will have two connected pawns in the center, will have a developed knight. Still the queen is endangered here. Normal development is perfectly fine here, knight to f3, then probably bishop to e2, bishop to d3, maybe bishop to c4 will happen. So in my opinion White will have a beautiful setup. So that's something that you should not do. So after move c takes d5, many times White is getting challenged with this idea, bishop takes b8. This is now the normal way here to proceed. You have to play simply this line if you want to get something out of it. In my opinion, other ideas for Black are simply even worse. So here after move bishop to b1, we have queen to a4. This is also a natural move that is played many times by White. The idea is clear, we want to force something, even if you try something like queen to d7, then queen to d7, knight to d7, and then rook takes b1. White is continuing the game with the bishop pair, which is in my opinion perfectly fine. The game is simplified, the game is not so complicated anymore, and that's many times what White wants to get, a simplified line, but with the bishop pair on the board, which is in my opinion of course a slightly favorable middle game stage than for White again. So that's why many times after move queen to a4, Black is playing like the Stockfish engine is playing here the move c6, and we have here d takes c6. Of course you cannot retreat with the bishop. We have talked about also this tactical ideas yesterday. Then you get this idea c7, even if you cover, then c8, the promotion is even checkmate, because you cannot take because of the activity here by the queen against the king. So this is something also that Black should always consider. So that's why after move d takes c6, Black needs now to play the move knight to c6. So we have now rook takes b1 and now e5. This is a move that you have to play again if you are reaching this position in the Baltic defense. You have to break and enter now. The problem always for White here is that d takes e5 is not good, because you get bishop to b4 and you cannot cover yourself. You have to sacrifice now the queen in order to stay in the game, but of course it's game over then. So that's why here after move e5, many times White is covering himself here with the move bishop to d2, but now we can take here. Of course this is in my opinion not good, because many times White will simply develop the light square bishop in this way. You have maybe sort of a space advantage with your pawn on d4, but now with bishop to g2 the game becomes really unpleasant here for White. So that's why pardon me, for Black. So that's why in my opinion advancing the pawn immediately is not such a good idea here for Black. So that's why queen to d4 was played by Stockfish. We have now this idea, queen to d4, knight to d4, and now after move e3, many times you will probably reach this position if you're playing the Baltic defense from White's perspective. Now with the move e3, notice that this idea knight to c2 is not so dangerous, because still we can kick away the knight knight, and after something like knight to b4, knight to f3, normal development is working here. You have to protect your pawn on e5. Now you play something like f6, but now with bishop to b5, the bishop comes out in a very active way. Maybe if you cover yourself with knight to c6, still we can take bishop takes c6, b takes c6, rook to c8, c1, attacking the pawn on c6. So the isolated pawn on c6 you get many times in the Baltic defense. I've played the Baltic defense a couple of times, and many times I reached similar position, maybe not the same, but wherever whenever I play this opening, I've reached simply this position where I have this isolated pawn on the c file, which in my opinion is of course not good. And that's exactly what will happen also in this game, because after move e3 that Chiron played, Stockfish simply retreated to c6, and again after knight to f3, bishop to d6. So here Stockfish didn't play f6, simply defended this pawn with the bishop. Here again Chiron played this pinning idea, bishop to b5. After a6, bishop takes c6, b takes c6. We have reached now again a similar position. So it's something I think that bothers always a Baltic defense player, the structural weaknesses that you get. So in my opinion, as I said here, white should be better, but Stockfish is Stockfish, you know. Stockfish can play every middle game, Stockfish can play basically every opening, and from this point on Stockfish is realizing, at least when we take b takes c6, that we have at least the open b file. So at least black can also create some attacks on the b file, which is I think at least something. Many times in the opening stage, in some middle game stages, you don't gain anything out of your opening. Now at least the b file is sort of a strategical idea. So here in the continuation we have kingside castling, we have f6, fixing now the pawn, a very important move I think, because now we want to play much more freely with our dark square bishop. So bishop to a5, we have king to d7, and now after rook to d1, of course this very annoying pin, but now Stockfish plays this normal rook attack, here rook to b8, attacking the b2 pawn. So we have now the knight to d2. This was of course a tiny trap, sort of. If you take rook takes b2, then you get knight to c4 the fork, you lose the bishop on d6. So that's why you have to get out of this tactical mess. We have knight to c4, and now bishop to e7, getting this bishop on this passive square, sort of, but at least you have a good protection of the d6. And now it's time to maybe search for new opportunities for the knight. The knight has to be included somewhere into the game. So you see, in this particular game also, black is simply defending the position. I don't think that black gained so many things out of the Baltic defense, but as I said, Stockfish is Stockfish. When Stockfish gets at least some kind of an opportunity, Stockfish will use it. So it's really wild what happened here in the continuation of the game. So here rook to d2, we have a rook to b5, attacking the bishop on a5. We have e4, very important move I think, to keep your pawns on life squares. This is also a good move I think by Chiron, because many times the bishop could be maneuvered here to maybe d2 and then to e3, where it controls of course new diagonals, new dark squares in the position. So after move e4, we have knight to h6. Finally the knight gets developed, and here after move rook to d1, rook from h to b8, and now bishop to c7, attacking the rook. We have a rook to c8, knight, bishop to b6, and now at least this knight is coming into the game, is controlling also further the d6 square. So we have now h4, creating some breathing spaces for the king. If of course something gets challenged on the first rank, then still this king can come into the game. I think also this is a very nice idea by Chiron, getting the king on h2, maybe on g3, then include the king simply further into attack. And also what we could try, if the knight maybe leaves a little bit too much here the king side, we could also try some ideas of h5, h6, trying to maybe split the pawn chain, sacrifice the pawn, but creating further weaknesses here on the king side. So it's also a strategical idea here by white. So here in the continuation now c5. This is a risky choice I think, because okay, you're temporarily trapping sort of the bishop here, but keeping your pawns on dark squares is very risky here, because then the bishop can attack your dark square pawns, and the problem is also you're blocking out a little bit further your own dark square bishops. As I said, many times when you have like here the dark square bishop on the board, you want to keep the pawns on light source. But as I said, this is now a clear idea. Stockfish is trying at least to attack this bishop twice and create some madness. So that's why bishop to a5. Chiron realizes that this bishop is a little bit loose on the board, so it's trying to maneuver the bishop to c3. So we have rook to c6, and now a4, attacking the rook. We have rook to b8, and now bishop to c3. And this is now what is, in my opinion, really the first mistake in the game, because bishop to c3 should not be played. What you should do is simply to keep your pieces active. You have to play here something like rook to d7, and now probably after knight to d6 the pieces can be traded off in this way. Rook to c7 can be played, so still you can trade off more pieces. And now after this one you can of course take stakes, and now you could also probably take the pawn on b7. This is now probably a better way for white to proceed. At least you have attacked the 7th rank, at least you're keeping the pieces active. Maybe it's a sacrifice, but here after bishop to c7, bishop to c3, and this is now a weird pawn here on f6. So at least my Stockfish engine is suggesting this wild line where you sacrifice the exchange for some activities, because this bishop is not good. As we said, the knight is holding the whole position. This rook is very active, and in the next move you will lose also probably this pawn, so it's a weakness also then in the continuation of the game. But this was really hard to see. I think a top engine like Chiron didn't play this move, played simply a passive bishop to c3, and Stockfish realizes now its chance that it could maybe go into a equalish endgame by playing the move knight to d6. And again, Chiron should have probably played knight takes d6, rook takes d6, then the game is more simplified. I think this should be a drawish endgame position for both of these engines, but unfortunately for this engine, knight to a5 was played, and now this rook attack, okay, it seems like a dangerous idea, but it doesn't bring anything because Stockfish simply retreats. And notice that now this knight is out of game. So basically Chiron trapped its own knight here. The knight cannot be maneuvered anywhere anymore in the position, so the knight is controlling this square, the rooks are controlling also this square, so it's simply now a bad knight. It's a bad knight on the edge of the board. So this is something I think that surprised me here by Chiron. It's also respected top engine. Of course, maybe it's not so strong like the top engines of these days, maybe like Stockfish, Dragon, but it's a 3000 rated top engine, and played now really such a beginner's move, which is really wild. Getting the knight on the edge of the board is really something that you should try to avoid. Notice that also now the e4 pawn is weak, so many structural weaknesses can happen now also in white's position. So we have rook to e2 protecting this pawn, but now g6, we have g3, we have c4. Look how Stockfish is paralyzing further the knight, and also is creating now a weak square here on b3. So we have now king to g2, knight to c8, trying to maneuver the knight, of course, here to b6, and then attack also the a4 weakness. So we have rook from e to d2, knight to b6, and now rook to a1, protecting this pawn. We have a rook to c8, and now king to f3. This king is coming into the game. We have a rook to d7, rook takes d7, and now king to d7. So again, let's stop and evaluate a little bit position. It's not losing here the game immediately for white, but I really don't like this knight activity. So the knight is simply too paralyzed here on the edge of the board. Meanwhile, this pawn is very annoying, and the problem is also that in one particular moment f5 will happen, so it's also a dynamic move, a dynamic possibility here for black. So here after move king to e2 was played, we have king to e6 again, knight to b7. Chiron is desperately trying to get this knight into the game, but notice that also this bishop is controlling always the c5 square. So even when the rook moves, of course the rook cannot move immediately to d8, but even if the rook moves somewhere, still you cannot use the c5 square in order to improve your knight's activity. So it's really a bad knight here on the board. So we have now f5, we have king to f3, we have rook to c7 attacking the knight, knight to a5. So you see the knight still has to play on this weird square on the edge of the board. So we bishop to c5, we have e takes f5, g takes f5, and now after a rook to e1, this is now of course the clear target, the weak pawn on e5. We have here e4 by Stockfish attacking simply the king. So even if you try something, I don't know, king to f4, notice that also here knight to e4 is very dangerous. Bishop to e7 is also potential check if you get the king maybe here. So you could get even, I think, checkmated if you try to create a path here for the king. So that's why king to g2 has to be played here by the Chiron engine, and here Stockfish simply proceeded with the normal knight to d5, attacking now the bishop. Here Chiron takes finally. because Chiron doesn't have any better move. You have to include now this knight into the game, but now comes, I think, a beautiful tactic. Bishop takes f2, king takes f2, but now after rook takes c4, notice that here, in my opinion, it's a much better position. This is a much stronger knight. First of all, what we should also notice is that this is a weak pawn, and also the bishop is hanging, so in one particular moment Stockfish is grabbing the pawn for sure. So that's why here a5 was played by Chiron. We have knight takes c3, b takes c3, and here after rook to c3, suddenly Stockfish has a completely winning endgame here. So really amazing stuff that Stockfish played here. It wasn't clear in the beginning what will happen out of this Baltic defense, but you know, Stockfish can play, as I said, simply everything. If you give Stockfish some chances, Stockfish will use it, and now it's simply winning endgame here for the beautiful engine. So rook to b1, we have rook to c2, we have king to e5. Here rook to b8 was played by Chiron. Even if you try a rook to b6, maybe to attack this pawn on a6, it's not the problem, because you get this one, and there's not a good way anymore to protect the g3 pawn. This pawn is very important now in the endgame, because if you take, then of course we will take out this one, and what we have created now are two connected pass pawns, and two connected pass pawns in a rook endgame are something that you should always try to do, because now, okay, you could have maybe something like this, but now we can just hide with our king, play something like, and I don't know, rook to a3, and we just create checks and push both of these pawns further. The cool part about this setup is that you cannot get checked by your opponent's rook, so it's very important to create, as I said, two connected pass pawns. If two connected pass pawns get on the third or maybe on the sixth rank, of course from white's perspective, then you have a completely winning endgame. So as I said here, you cannot just attack this pawn. You have to protect first of all your g3 pawn. So here the continuation, rook to c3 anyway, we have king to f2, rook to f3, kicking away further the king, we have king to g2, and now rook to a3. So you see, even in this scenario, Stockfish will grab at least this pawn, so it's the white doesn't have time here to make anything. So we have king to f2, Stockfish grabs another pawn, we have a new check, we have king to d4, rook to d8, we have now rook to d5, covering of course the d file. Now of course if white trades off the rooks, the game is over for white, so that's why rook to h8, and now h5. We have rook to h5, and now e3. Very nice move, because after king to f3 we have now rook to e5, and this is now supported pass pawn. You have to protect, of course, the further progress. You have to play e2. But now rook to b5, again Stockfish is threatening some ideas of rook to b2, and now if you play something like king to f3, notice that also rook to f2 could be a beautiful checkmate. So it's also something that bothers now white at the continuation of the game. So that's why rook to h6, we have now this check. You cannot go of course to f3 because you get checkmated. So here king to e4, and see Stockfish found a beautiful way how to include now the king into the game. So we have rook to f6, we have a5, h5, here a4, h6, a3, h7, and now after rook to h2, this is game over. We can always catch up with this pawn. Even if a2 happens, you cannot just protect it, because after a1, even if you take rook to a1, then you get rook to h8, and you lose probably the rook. So it's simply game over here for white. Rook to a6 was played here. Stockfish tried this one, king to f3. Of course, rook to h1 is a potential checkmate, so that's why king to g1. Now Stockfish simply took. We have rook to a3, rook to g7. Now this pawn is hanging, so here after rook to c3, f4, rook to d3, and in this position Chiron resigned. So amazing stuff. Really wild game. I'm not sure what to say, because in my opinion still the Baltic defense is something that you should try to avoid, but Stockfish can play whatever Stockfish wants to play. Let's go back to this critical moment, c6. So we're playing the knight to c6, and now in this opening stage you have to play e5. Notice that in these types of lines you will probably get pinned in one particular moment by bishop to b5. You will probably have some structural weaknesses, so be careful when you're playing the Baltic defense, because you get many times a tough position to play. It's not something that I think you want to get out of the opening, so there are many better openings. So but okay, this was simply a game that I wanted to show you, because I think as a surprise surprise element. Maybe in some blitz bullet games you can use sometimes the Baltic defense in these types of lines. So okay, I hope that you enjoyed the game. I really enjoyed it a lot. Interesting ideas in the Baltic defense from Black's perspective. If you want to see our first study also in the Baltic defense, check out my coverage so far. Here's the link of our intro video in which I've showed you the most important traps and tactical ideas of the opening. And if you want to see more Stockfish brutal games, check out my commented chess games played by computer series with some more games played by Stockfish, Alpha Zero, Lila Zero, and many more. And if you like this content, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you soon with some more videos, and chess is the best, of course.